This video is made possible by Humankind, the historical turn-based strategy game. Humankind is a fresh, civilization-building PC game revolutionizing the 4X strategy genre. Combine elements from over 60 famous civilizations throughout history to create your own unique empire, and follow them from their first settlement to their final spaceflight. Create your own personal avatar to lead your empire, customize it as you progress, and challenge strangers and friends alike in multiplayer games up to 8 players. You can oversee everything from the vast expansion of your territory to the minute, heavy impact decisions that will test both your civilization's morals and diplomacy. Amass fame to guarantee your place in history and in-game victory, even if you meet an ill-fated end. Your choices will weave together to form a thoughtful, independent, story-driven experience unique to you. At Simple History, we were impressed with the massive options and mix-and-match cultures we would build. Not being confined to a single historical country meant we felt free to experiment and borrow from civilizations throughout history to form the ultimate empire, exactly to our specifications. Ready to build your own legacy? Jump into the endless world of Humankind today using our link in the description. How far will you push Humankind? The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, Pompeii disaster, 79 AD. At the beginning of 79 AD, the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, situated in Campania on the Bay of Naples in southern Italy, were both bustling centers of human activity. Pompeii was a busy commercial center with a population estimated to have been anywhere between 6,400 and 30,000. Herculaneum, on the other hand, was a smaller and more exclusive place, popular with the Roman elite, as is attested by the number of luxurious villas that have been discovered there. By the end of the year, both of them lay buried under meters of volcanic mud and ash, victims of one of the worst geological disasters in recorded history, an event so cataclysmic that it still horrifies almost 2,000 years later, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The 1st century AD residents of Campania had little reason to suspect that they were in imminent danger. Vesuvius, which had not erupted in well over 1,000 years, was not considered a source for concern, and its surrounding landscape was as fertile and picturesque then as it is today. The nutriously rich volcanic soil and the Mediterranean climate provided the perfect environment in which to grow an abundance of fruit and vegetables, while the close proximity to the sea meant that fresh seafood was plentiful. Although Roman society of this period was by no means egalitarian, archaeological evidence tells us that even the poor could expect to have a healthy and varied diet. Trade, too, flourished, with evidence supporting the regular export of Pompeian wine and vegetables, again suggesting that there was often a surplus of food. Amphorae filled with goods that were imported from a variety of locations, including Crete, Spain, and Gaza, have been excavated. The area had long been seen as a playground for the elites of Roman society, and it's known that more than one emperor chose to take his holidays there. Vesuvius itself may not have been viewed as a threat, but the region was geologically active. A large earthquake that occurred in either 62 or 63 AD did significant damage to the buildings of Pompeii, so much so that it's possible that restoration work was still underway in 79 AD. There was no way that the Romans could have known it, but this was almost certainly a precursor to the coming eruption. Smaller tremors occurred regularly and were seen as an inconvenient but minor irritation of daily life, even as they began to increase in frequency. The precise date of the eruption is now contested, but a combination of archaeological and geological evidence gives us a window into how the events unfolded. Remarkably, an eyewitness account has also survived in the form of 2 letters written 25 years after the event by Pliny the Younger, a Roman writer and official, to his friend, the historian Tacitus. The dates traditionally ascribed to the eruption, the 24th and 25th of August, were taken from a medieval copy of one of Pliny's letters. However, recent archaeological discoveries, including ancient graffiti, coins, and the remains of pomegranates and walnuts, both of which would have been harvested in the autumn, suggest it occurred as late as October. In whichever month it took place, we know that the day of the eruption broke much like any other. Pliny, who was at the time living with his mother and uncle, Pliny the Elder, at Misenum, approximately 30 kilometers from the volcano, tells us that a little after midday a large dark cloud shaped like a pine tree was seen rising above one of the nearby mountains. Pliny the Elder, who was at the time the commander of the imperial fleet, but is perhaps best known to history for his writings on the natural world, made plans to take a vessel across the bay to investigate the phenomenon. His mission took on a rather more urgent nature when, as he was preparing to set out, he received a message from a friend living at Stabiae, close to Pompeii, begging for assistance. According to Pliny the Younger, several Roman warships then took to the water to mount a rescue mission, not only for his uncle's friend, but also for the refugees attempting to escape from the settlements along the bay. As the ships got closer to the volcanic cinders, which grew thicker and hotter, along with pumice stones and black pieces of burning rock, it rained down on them, and they were in danger of being run aground by the sudden retreat of the sea. When his ship's pilot advised turning back, Pliny the Elder refused to do so, allegedly proclaiming that fortune favors the brave. Unfortunately, in this case, he was incorrect. It's not known how many people, if any, were saved by the actions of the fleet, but we do know that Pliny the Elder perished in the attempt. The dark, pine tree-shaped cloud was in fact a convective column of ash, rocks, pumice, water vapor, and toxic gases that would eventually rise to more than 30 kilometers in height. Southeasterly winds pushed the column towards Pompeii, blocking out the sun and plunging the doomed city into darkness so complete that Pliny describes it as if the lamp had gone out in a dark room. Within a few hours, the buildings of Pompeii and those residents who had not yet fled were being bombarded by ash, pumice, and other forms of volcanic debris. Throughout this stage of the eruption, Herculaneum, which lay to the west of the mountain, was spared, although its inhabitants would have been more than aware of what was going on. The relative lack of human remains that have been discovered there suggests that many people were able to evacuate during the early stages of the eruption. It was long believed that very few people had perished in Herculaneum. This view changed in the early 1980s, however, with the grisly discovery of the extremely well-preserved skeletons of refugees who had taken shelter in several boathouses along the shoreline. The remains of more than 300 individuals have now been identified, and excavations are still going on. Over the course of that day, ash and pumice accumulated in Pompeii at up to 15 centimeters per hour, and after several hours the weight was such that the roofs of the buildings began to collapse. By midnight, the first stage of the eruption, which had seen the formation of the immense column that still towered above Vesuvius, was coming to an end. This first phase has been what scientists now refer to as a Plinian Eruption, so named because Pliny provided the first scientific description of one. As the column began to lose its upward momentum, it began to collapse, triggering the first of several pyroclastic flows. These were dense clouds of toxic gases and volcanic matter that reached temperatures of up to 900 degrees Celsius and sped down the mountain at hundreds of miles per hour, collecting debris and annihilating every living thing in their paths. Over the next few hours, 7 of these surges would occur, the first of which spared Pompeii but devastated Herculaneum, killing all those who remained. Pompeii survived the night, but at around 6:30 a.m. it was struck by the 4th surge and buried up to its rooftops. Pliny's account finishes shortly after this with a description of his flight from Misenum and the aftermath of the eruption. You might hear the shrieks of women, the screams of children, and the shouts of men, some calling for their children, others for their parents, others for their husbands, and seeking to recognize each other by the voices that replied. One lamenting his own fate, another that of his family, some wishing to die. From the very fear of dying, some lifting their hands to the gods, but the greater part convinced that there were now no gods at all, and that the final endless night of which we have heard had come upon the world. But the night did end, and when the sun finally emerged from the darkness, it shone down on a world that looked very different. At last, this dreadful darkness was dissipated by degrees, like a cloud or smoke. The real day returned, and even the sun shone out, though with a lurid light, like when an eclipse is coming on. Every object that presented itself to our eyes, which were extremely weakened, seemed changed, being covered deep with ashes as if with snow. Both Pompeii and Herculaneum were submerged, as were several other settlements. The shoreline around the Bay of Naples had been significantly and permanently altered, and everything was covered in a thick layer of ash. Modern analysis tells us that the eruption may have continued on a reduced scale for several days or even weeks, and that there may have been as many as 20 further surges. It's impossible to determine precisely how many people were killed, but the number is certainly in the thousands. So far, archaeologists have discovered the remains of more than 1,400 individuals who can safely be identified as victims of the eruption, including the skeletons at Herculaneum. Around 25% of Pompeii has yet to be excavated, but assuming that remains continue to be found at a similar rate to the rest of the site, we can estimate that about 2,000 people died there. About 38% of the individuals at Pompeii were found to have died during the earlier stage of the eruption as a result of the ash and pumice deposits. The vast majority of these were found sheltering inside buildings and probably died from asphyxiation or building collapse. The remaining 62% have been discovered in layers associated with the pyroclastic flows that destroyed the city. These people were exposed to temperatures in excess of 250 degrees Celsius. This is hot enough that the thermal shock would have killed them in a fraction of a second. As the volcanic deposits hardened over the bodies of the dead and their organic matter decomposed, hollows were created within the layers, from which modern archaeologists are able to create detailed plaster casts of the ancient Pompeians, the contorted postures of which are the result of sudden heat-induced contraction of the muscles, rather than prolonged agony. The story at Herculaneum was somewhat different. The city was closer to Vesuvius than Pompeii, and as such, the pyroclastic flows were much hotter when they reached it. Precisely how the people died there is still being debated, but one theory has it that the intense heat would have instantaneously boiled their blood and brains and vaporized soft tissues. In the case of one victim who was found above ground, the temperature was hot enough to turn at least some of his brain matter to glass. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, some attempt was made by Rome to provide aid to the citizens of Campania. Emperor Titus visited the region and granted large donations from the imperial treasury. The following year, 2 former consuls were ordered to the region to oversee the relief effort. Despite these attempts, Pompeii and Herculaneum were beyond saving. But contrary to what is commonly believed, neither city was entirely forgotten. At Pompeii, we have clear evidence of people returning to the city in the form of precarious tunnels carved through the ash. Whether these were the actions of the original owners or of opportunistic looters is impossible to determine. Centuries later, the names of both cities appeared on a medieval map, presumably copied from an earlier original. Vesuvius has erupted several more times over the millennia, but none of these events have even come close to matching the ferocity of that which occurred in 79 AD. It's perhaps ironic that the force of nature that doomed the ancient Campanians created the perfect conditions for preservation. Pompeii and Herculaneum provided an unparalleled insight into the Roman world, frozen as they were in time. The remarkable condition of their remains, and in particular the plaster casts at Pompeii, which quite literally give a human face to the tragedy that unfolded, bring the past tantalizingly close. Mount Vesuvius still dominates the skyline at the Bay of Naples and is currently considered to be one of the most dangerous active volcanoes in Europe. It is a matter of when, not if, the next eruption occurs. For this reason, the seismic activity of the area is constantly monitored, and evacuation plans have been put in place. Nevertheless, were an eruption of a similar scale to occur today, the lives of up to 3 million people would be endangered, and the city of Naples would potentially meet the same fate as its ancient counterparts.